Greetings, Mayhemers. Well, in the last episode of Stream of Consciousness, we talked about some definitions of what consciousness might be. I distilled it down to a very simple definition of a mind operating in an environment, okay? Well, today we're going to ask the question of what happens when we have more than one mind operating together in the same environment, and what does consciousness look like then? So we're going to talk about some social aspects of consciousness and what it means when you're talking about consciousness over groups and populations of people as opposed to one singular person. Because we know that no matter how much we might want to be the only person in the universe sometimes, we don't exist in a vacuum and we do share our reality. So we're going to talk about the social aspects of consciousness, like the collective unconsciousness or consensus reality, or a few other things that we're going to explore a little bit. So when you think about these ideas, you might think of a colony of ants sort of working in unison without a central directive other than the pheromonal signals from its queen. You might think of herd behavior, like cattle in a field or something like that. You might think of a flock of birds like starlings twisting and turning in unison as they move to their, destination. But how does this work in humans? I mean, we know that for the most part, we're individuals. We think for ourselves, we have very unique perspectives, but over time and over large groups of people, we find that there's all this commonality and all of these sort of behaviors that humans exhibit that are much like a herd of cattle or a colony of ants. And it's something that's used widely and exploited by things like marketers or politicians or religion. But it's not really like the Borg from Star Trek. I don't think it's quite that extreme. But we do apparently share some sort of non-local operating environment where we pull symbols from the most primal aspects of human history. But when we think about all of us operating such as a colony of ants or a herd of cattle, we have to ask ourselves, we're still individuals, right? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to start off with Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconsciousness. So he was a student of Freud originally, and he developed his theory of the collective unconsciousness from Freud's theory of the personal unconscious. So in Freud's theory, he had this concept of the primal horde, which was this sort of leftover set of images and symbols and urges that were from the very most primitive traces of man's history, those primal urges. In Jung's theory, however, though, this contributed to a slightly more enhanced part of consciousness where, the collective unconsciousness is populated by instincts like hunger, sexuality, activity, reflection, and creativity. And these are like sort of those lower primal urges of the unconscious mind. But there's also, in Jung's theory, archetypes. So the archetypes are the pervasive mythological symbols that we seem to understand and react to, whether they actually fit our life experiences or not. So Jung divided these into ego and the shadow. So they exist as a dualism, the divine mother versus the terrible mother, the old wise man and the trickster, order and chaos, meaning and absurdity, just to name a few. And although Jung's archetypes all existed in these dualities, there's actually a ton of research now in a library of over 18,000 different archetypal images, and that is located at Archive for Research in Archetypal Symbolism. And if you can afford to get behind the $100 paywall, you can actually look at all of those images. A good example of Jung's idea of how the collective unconsciousness worked, a famous example he gave was in a patient he had suffering with schizophrenia, who described dreams and images of a giant tube, like a penis, coming out of the sun and blowing wind out over the earth, which is very much reflective of the mythology of Mithras, which also has a sort of phallic tube-like thing coming out of the sun. And in Jung's mind, it was quite unlikely that this guy had, read this sort of esoteric mythological work. So with the collective unconsciousness, one thing that is certainly an issue is examining it scientifically. So a lot of people have a problem with that because it's not a falsifiable concept. It's not something that you can observe or test in any kind of direct way, anyhow. But we can talk a little bit about some of the indirect scientific underpinnings that may support this idea of a collective unconsciousness. But it is very difficult to scientifically examine sort of that subjective and mythological piece of the puzzle. But in biology and ethology, there is imprinting and release mechanisms, which is sort of an innate thing that is passed on genetically from parent to offspring, where things like feeding and suckling and those sort of things are biologically pre-programmed and then released according to environmental stimuli. And if you want to learn more about that, I would just suggest doing some research on your own. Same with all of the concepts that I'm going to talk about, because I've got a lot of really big dots to connect here. So when you hear me throwing around some of these terms, I'm not assuming that you know what it means. I'm assuming that it's going to be interesting enough for you to do some research on your own. I mean, that's kind of what we have to do in this age of the internet. I mean, I could spend hours talking about any one of these concepts, but some scientists have speculated that the collective unconsciousness may actually be mediated through the thalamus and limbic system of the brain, as it's the most ancient system in the brain and is responsible for a lot of those instincts. In psychology and neuroscience, you have the concept of genetic and ancestral memory. So that is when you have memories of past lives or dreams or things that don't fit your experience but seem to belong to a different era that came before you. Obviously, that is something that still pretty much exists somewhere in the realm where psychology and mysticism sort of overlap, and we're going to kind of dance around some of that as we go forward. So, another potential way that collective unconsciousness is mediated at the biological level, and this is a little bit of a reach, but we do know that some psychological phenomenon are related to epigenetics, and that is basically a way in which genes are imprinted during the lifespan of an organism through processes like DNA and histone methylation and a few others. I'm not a biologist, so I'm not going to sit and pretend to be an expert on that. That's something you can look up on your own time for sure. But when we think about collective unconsciousness, one thing that comes to mind, especially when thinking about sort of Carl Jung's different archetypes. So in the world of religion and spirituality, not only do we see those archetypes play out in ways that are common across several religions, such as that sort of righteous and terrible father. Okay, that's a dualistic image. I mean, a lot of people have often read the Bible and wondered, how is God this ultra-loving father figure and at the same time this wrathful old man that's going to burn the planet? I mean, it's a hard thing to think about, and it requires a little bit of moral and mental gymnastics to get there. But I think it's become so commonplace over time and space that it's just an accepted part of who we are. I mean, even as an atheist, I'm certainly influenced by Judeo-Christian archetypes, and I actually love religious imagery. I mean, I think it's beautiful. It's something that I resonate with and react to, even though I don't believe in a deity, so to speak. But when we're thinking about this, we can also think about how the God of Islam is also sort of archetypal. But then you have religions like Hinduism that have several thousand gods, and the gods are split into these sort of like dualities or triads or whatever, where you have the creator, Brahma, you have Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. They're all aspects of sort of a centralized deity, but they're these relationships that are easy to fathom, even though we aren't Hindu. I mean, for me, I don't have a very deep knowledge of the religion, but I can certainly look at those symbols and get some sort of a sense of what's going on. And that's kind of like where this concept of collective unconsciousness comes into play, because we see those themes play out in our dreams. And I think that when we have our deepest wants and fears, and we look at that over time, we see how cultures and religions are developed from sort of like a deep sense of want, and some of these very ancient symbols and things like that are probably traced all the way back to the very most primal parts of human development. But to get outside of the concept of archetypes, because I mean, that's another thing that a very, very, very long video could just be done on different archetypal research. I want to talk about some other indirect concepts that lead to this sort of notion that we've had a suspicion throughout a good part of our history that our minds are somehow interconnected. When I say that, I don't mean like telepathy. I mean more like a very passive and deeply buried internet of the mind. And that may be a bit of a reach, but even, in ancient Greece, there is the concept of the anima mundi, the world soul, which, basically asserted that all things that are conscious are somehow connected under this primeval oversoul of the planet. Again, in Hinduism, you have the Brahman-Atman relationship, the yin and yang in Taoism. You have Gaia, the mother spirit of the planet. In Judaism, you have the concept of Chakma, which is this all-encompassing wisdom, right, that surrounds reality. It seems to be reflective of this idea of a collective or shared unconscious part of the mind. So when we're thinking about this kind of stuff, we have to wonder, like, where does it come from? Like, we don't really sit around and think about it, very often. Just, I mean, I do, but I don't think most people do. I think it just plays out. Where does this imagery come from, and why is it still active for us in our daily life? Why do we still respond to concepts and images and situations of things that we haven't experienced? I mean, when you watch the news, you see that there are very, very polarized political groups of the population, right? In America, it's our conservative and liberal political parties. But it's interesting how so much of those populations vote, react, and behave based on very deep-seated fears of things that they've probably never personally experienced. Think about that for a minute. There's a sort of identity and persona that comes into that. And certainly when you think about Jung's collective unconsciousness, the sort of movement out of that toward individuality is that formulation of a persona from that collective pool of thought. What happens is you have a herd, a group of people who flock to these sort of like mutually constructed identities, because they have one piece that they really resonate with, and therefore they assume, even passively, that the rest of it also pertains to them. But I mean, I really don't think that a large percentage of our conservative population have been terrorized by immigrants, but yet they're all terrified of immigrants, because that's what the collective unconsciousness that they've identified with tells them to do. Which then makes you realize that there's sort of divisions inside of the collective unconsciousness, because obviously conservative and liberal folks aren't occupying the same space, or maybe they are. I guess that's something worth some deeper thought. Well, let's get out of politics. Politics is boring. It's the same 5 conversations for all of history. Who really fucking cares? It's going to keep shifting back and forth, and we're all going to be miserable until somebody decides that they're going to stop making us fucking miserable. And I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, and I don't think it's going to happen in the lifetime of my youngest viewers. So we're just gonna bypass that shit. We'll talk about stuff that's a little more interesting. So In terms of various traditions of mysticism and spirituality, there are a few avenues I think that people have supposed maybe ways of sort of tapping into this primeval oversoul or this collective unconsciousness. You have things like transcendental meditation, where they transcend into some sort of unified field of thought. Okay, it's kind of vague and amorphous. I don't really fully understand it. It seems like more of an experiential state, but there are also interesting things like shared dreams. So there's a lot of documented cases of people sharing the same dream, even whether it was intentionally or not. Obviously, the most famous kinds of documentations of these are going to be from studies of twins or married couples, but I've even heard of some instances where therapists and clients ended up sharing the same dreams because of the sort of deep connection they had found in their relationship. But there's also allegedly the ability to do this intentionally through the process of lucid dreaming or some advanced forms of meditation that maybe could be unpacked in a different video. But lucid dreaming is the kind of dream that you have where you're aware that you're dreaming, and there's ways to achieve it intentionally. I mean, you can engage in, it's called mild, it's mnemonic induction lucid dreaming. So what you do is as you're falling asleep and you're in that hypnagogic state, you auto-suggest to yourself over and over again that you're going to remember your dream. They also suggest doing reality checks throughout the day, like looking at your hands and asking yourself if you're dreaming. And that way, when you dream, you can also do those reality checks, and that's supposed to induce lucid dreaming. Personally, I use auto suggestion and auto induction. So what I'll do is auto suggest, and then I'll plant an object such as a light switch, and when I flip it on and off, it provokes the lucid dream. I'll provide some more detailed instructions about how to train lucid dreaming at the end of the video, because I like to give my viewers a little something to take home with them out of each one. And for this one, I'm going to give you some instructions about how to train lucid dreaming and how to keep a dream journal. And I'm going to ask some questions at the end too about observing collective consciousness, unconsciousness, and consensus reality behaviors after you've watched this video, and let me know kind of what you've noticed and what you've come up with. But the reason I'm talking about lucid dreaming, okay, is because that lucid dreaming is a mode of dreaming in which archetypes become more vivid and a little bit more intentional. You can work with those archetypes that fall into your own ego or shadow. You're going to find that they're going to pop up. And certainly, this is not just an activity that you should pursue because it sounds interesting. You should do it, when you're feeling, pretty sound of mind, to be able to explore some of those deeper parts of consciousness, because sometimes some surprising things can come of that, and they can be hard to deal with. But I think for those of you that are interested in this sort of thing, you're probably already doing interesting and fun stuff like that anyway. So this will just be an additional tool in your own toolbox. Something else that's indicative of collective consciousness or collective unconsciousness through that sort of state of dreaming, or transcendental meditation, or any of these other exercises that can pull you toward this sort of collective non-local operating space. And that's what I'm going to refer to the collective unconsciousness as a non-local operating space. You can't pinpoint it to a mind. You can't pinpoint it to a source. It's not actually here. That's why it's so hard for science to touch it, because it's not falsifiable or testable. So it really isn't even an appropriate subject for science to explore. It's something that's more of a philosophical or spiritual or personal endeavor. For those of you who are intronautic or psychonautic, this is right up your alley, and you're probably already doing some of this stuff. But an interesting phenomenon that has been sort of talked about is the Akashic Record. So this originates in the theosophical and anthroposophical movements, spearheaded most popularly by H.P. Blavatsky, which is a non-physical or etheric record of all of human thought and experience. In my own experiences, when I've had dreams where I was dreaming lucidly and was in a library. This was the closest to the Akashic record I could ever find, and I was always able to access this sort of weird infinite tower of literature well, I'll do a separate thing on dreaming later. We can talk a little bit more about that in depth. I think that'll be a fun segment to do separately. So, but the Akashic record is allegedly, this sort of like giant record of all of human knowledge, all of human thought, all of human experience, past, present, and future. And to me, that is another reflection of what the collective unconsciousness might be. But we're going to pull back out of the mystical for a quick second, and we're going to talk about development and culture. So, in science and philosophy, there is sort of this big divide about what it is when a human is born. Are they a blank slate? And this is the sort of empiricist tabula rasa is what it's called. It says that we're born as a blank slate, and everything is a matter of paired associations with the environment, and that is how we develop, and we develop according to our responses to common stimuli. Okay, and then there's more of the nativist idea, which means that we are born with some pre-programmed functions. So some famous nativists are like Noam Chomsky, whose nativist theory of language suggests that we have some innate ability to respond to different languages that is then sort of like specified as we are raised, right? But we have this innate sort of module to address and develop language in very, very, very universal ways. The assertion or the thought is that that is an innate biological function. Another nativist is Steven Pinker, who, if I am framing this correctly, basically believes that we're born with some innate cognitive modules, which is why development looks so similar across cultures. Why developmental ages are very, very similar. They're not identical. There are cultural differences, but it seems to be biological, but obviously that flies in the face of that blank slate idea. So I mean, that's, I think, something that's worthy of debating, and it's going to be a while, I think, before that's settled in either science or philosophy. But when we think about all of this stuff and we put it together, and we think about multiple minds operating in the environment, we think about those more esoteric and mystical symbols and how those come down to us, and how those evoke thoughts and reactions and feelings within us. Then we have to go back to that idea of development and language and culture. So one thing I'm going to recommend is that you all take a look at a video by Ken Gergen, who talks about social construction in very great detail. The guy is clearly an expert in the subject. But social construction is the idea that there's a great portion of reality that we experience that is shaped entirely by agreements and relationships that are mediated through language. And basically the way social construction works is that there's a few premises that you have to understand in order to get it. And that is, firstly, that an object really doesn't make any demands on us about the way we talk about it. So Gergen uses like a water bottle. I'm going to use my coffee cup, right? I show this to you and you know it's a coffee cup because we agree that it's a coffee cup, right? That's what we use it for. We use it mostly to drink coffee. Okay, but the object in and of itself doesn't tell us that we have to call it that. That's something that we agree upon. The second assertion is that language is used to do things with objects, okay? And what we do with objects is based on how we have our own relationships and how we agree about how to use an object. So for those of us who are coffee drinkers, or those of us who are just regular folks, the idea that this is a coffee mug is good enough. However, for something like a chemist, you're going to be thinking in terms of volume. You're going to be thinking in terms of chemical composition. So for instance, I take a drink of my coffee, and I'm like, dang, that's nice and bold and rich, right? That tastes really good. The language that a chemist is going to use is going to be something like, the solution contains an optimal mixture of tannic acid and caffeine, right? That seems to be widely accepted among consumers, or something like that. I don't know. But that's a different linguistic agreement. So there's nothing about the coffee mug or the coffee within it that demands any of that language. The idea behind social construction and then is once we've constructed it, there's no such thing as a neutral value. So every time we socially agree upon something, it assigns a value to it. Even if you break it down to the empiricist piece, the scientific piece of it, all of those units of measurement and all of that language are based on relationships and agreement with about how to use language to engage in science. Okay, so an artist may look at this coffee mug and say, hey, that's a really, really well made coffee mug. Hey, I like what it says on it. You know, like the rest of us might not even be looking at that. It's hard to tell. The reason I'm talking a little bit about this social construction piece, though, is because it's another piece of this large puzzle of consciousness that we're going to keep trying to put together throughout the course of this series. There's that aspect of consciousness that is operating in an environment and constructing, right? We went over that in the first video. And now we're talking about many minds doing that in one environment. Linguistic agreement, okay? So if we know that there's a certain part of our reality that is socially constructed, and it doesn't mean that the object itself changes if we change our agreements. It just means that what the object means to us changes based on how we agree upon it, right? And the reason that this is important is because this might be sort of one of the ways in which information is written into collective unconsciousness or consensus reality. So part of what I'm going to challenge you to do this time, after you've done watch this video, is to think about how collective consciousness, consensus reality, and collective unconsciousness manifest in our daily lives. I did give some shiny examples about how it manifests in sort of like the polarized political environment that we live in right now. You know, people having fears of things they've never experienced. You know, the outsider, order versus chaos, us versus them, right versus wrong. You know, those are some interesting dualities that we react to without even really seriously considering whether or not they apply. And that's one aspect of collective consciousness or unconsciousness, depending on which way you want to look at it. Both that you can see in everyday life. Another thing is marketing and branding. So we know that people respond to symbols, people respond to colors, people respond to thoughts, feelings, and ideas that they get from looking at advertisements of a product, right? And it's interesting to me that the brands themselves, the symbols that go with these brands, not only influence the buying and selling and lifestyle patterns of large groups of people, but then their other affiliated groups and symbols also then overlap to influence that, you know? So it's interesting that I think that you could probably track, you know, certain buying and selling patterns based on religion. You can track certain pieces of it based on perceived status. You could track certain bits of it based on the symbols of the marketing brands themselves. Another interesting thing to look at then, in terms of collective consciousness, unconsciousness, and consensus reality, is right in your own Facebook feed. You look in there and you're going to see meme culture, which is something we're all familiar with now, right? But the idea of meme culture actually is the concept of a thought in and of itself that is viral and spreads throughout the group. It doesn't have a necessary source at the end of the day. It's not something that can be traced, tested, or measured. Something that just sort of infects a population of people and spreads. Well, what happens when you have large groups of memes, right, condensing under the unified identity of a brand? Okay. What is the brand symbol that's governing all of those small memes? What's its role? And that's going to be something we're going to unpack in a different video, but I'm just going to leave that out there to tease you a little bit, because I think you're going to find that at a certain point, some of these things take on a life of their own and then retroactively affect the people who believe in them. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But the considerations I want you to leave with after watching this video is how we also have a collective operating environment. There's the inner space that I talked about in the first video, that non-local operating environment. But then you talk about the collective consciousness, and you're talking about an entirely non-local operating environment. And as you're moving forward and you're watching the news and you're watching trends and you're watching your Facebook feed and you're watching how people act at the fucking grocery store, I want you to think about it. How is this collective unconsciousness influencing you? How do you influence it? I think that those are some important considerations to keep in mind along the way. So if you enjoyed today's video, I'd like you to like, subscribe, and share. Definitely, if you're feeling especially generous, I'd love for you to support us on Patreon, so that it becomes easier for me to keep producing this content for you, and maybe helping some of the rest of the group to produce some more content for you. After the video, I'm going to give you the instructions about dream journaling and lucid dreaming for you to take home and do with as you please. But in the meantime, I thank you for tuning in, and have a good one. All right, guys. So like I said, I'm going to give you a couple of tips for keeping a dream journal and some skills to help you train lucid dreaming. So I touched lightly on these during the video, but I want to elaborate just a little bit for you so you can have a better understanding of how and why it works. So the point of dream journaling is to cue your mind into remembering its own dreams in greater detail over time. If you've noticed that there's sometimes you remember dreams and sometimes you don't. Sometimes there's really not a rhyme or reason to it, and maybe sometimes the ones that you may have wanted to remember, you didn't. It's really hard telling. So let's start with the concept of dream journaling. This is certainly a way that you can start getting some exposure to how archetypes are happening in your own internal psyche. So what you're going to do is have a small notebook or a voice recorder by your bed. You want it right by your bed so that when you wake up, you can immediately write down the most memorable aspects of the dream. And what you want to do is kind of write it in the order it comes to mind. But another thing to do is to come back to that entry later and see if you can jog your memory and start filling in some of those details to write a more detailed narrative after you've actually, gotten to be awake and thinking about it. But the act of writing it down when you first wake up is going to be what kind of keeps it locked in your memory. And so what you want to do is start with the overall sort of like theme of the dream. I was in a house, or I was walking with so-and-so, or I was in a dark woods. Okay. You jot 2 or 3 lines down. Another thing that could be important too then is once you've come to waking up, would be jotting down a quick line of what happened the day before. Okay. Because then you can start seeing what parts of the dream are influenced by your daily experiences versus those that aren't. And what I would recommend doing is just having simple, small entries. So 5 or 6 lines. Your date, the quick line about the dream, quick line about how you felt about it, and then the quick line about what happened the day before you fell asleep. So that's going to be one way that you're going to be able to, get some increased memory and exposure in your dreams. And it's also going to help set you up for lucid dreaming in the future. And it's also going to make your dream journal much more interesting when you start working on lucid dreaming, because you'll have much more detailed and intentional dreams. So basically now about lucid dreaming, there's a lot of techniques you can research out there. I'm just going to tell you about a couple of the ones that I use. I use the autosuggestion technique, which is that that mnemonic induction lucid dreaming. And the way that works is when you're laying down to go to sleep, you may notice that there's that sort of state where you're half awake and half asleep. Sometimes you can still hear maybe your TV bleeding and it's starting to influence some of the imagery in your mind, or something along those lines. During that state of sleep is when you want to start suggesting to yourself, I'm going to remember my dream. I'm going to remember my dream. Or I'm going to be aware that I'm dreaming. I'm going to be aware that I'm dreaming. You can use that hypnagogic state to suggest memory so that you can write it down when you wake up. You may find yourself remembering your dreams more often, but you can also use it to suggest that you are going to go into a lucid state. What I do is I use a sort of induction technique that involves planting an object in the dream. So I'll often plant something like a light switch, doorknob, touchstone, cellular device, something that I can interact with when I do it helps to trigger that lucid dream state. Now, none of these methods are foolproof, and they do require some practice, but you'll find that over time it's a developed skill. Another thing that some people have suggested to me over time is something like a lot of dreams seem to move in a linear direction, move forward. If you turn and face in the opposite direction, that can also provoke lucid dreaming. So those are just a couple of possible steps. Another one is using the mild technique just as you start to wake up in the hypnopompic state, which is very similar to the hypnagogic state. Your brain is doing some of the similar things, but then you suggest yourself back to sleep and then have a memorable dream. I don't suggest that because falling right back asleep after you've just woken up can cause you to feel really tired. So you can just kind of play with this and do some research online. There's like tons and tons of different literature out there about how to mess with your dreams and whatnot. When you're looking at your dream journal and when you're tracking this stuff over time, you're going to eventually notice themes emerging. You're going to notice themes of landscaping, architecture, people, feelings, colors, objects. Keep track of some of that stuff. For instance, like the presence of water can suggest change over time, and what your relationship to that water is may have something to do with the way you're adjusting to that change, such as, you know, canoeing down a stream versus being swept away in its currents probably has two different connotations, and it's highly subjective. And what I would do if I were you, if you have a friend who's interested, or if you want to do some research yourself, is to find some ways to start then interpreting what you have in your dream journal, because that can be fascinating in and of its own right. So if you found that these exercises are helpful and interesting, there's definitely a lot more stuff out there that you can look up. These are just some stuff that I've used over time to help myself stay an active dreamer as I move into middle adulthood. So for those of you that are having trouble dreaming or remembering dreams, this could also be helpful to sort of stimulate that part of your mind again. So again, thank you very much. Have a good night.